Welcome to another edition of the C-State podcast. And this is specifically another of the security leader interview sessions. And I'm super excited to have friend and colleague and true pioneer in the space, Bryan Singer, who is currently the Principal Director of Security Innovation at Accenture. Welcome to the show, Bryan Singer.
Thank you very much, Derek. It's nice to be on.
Okay, so as I always like to start these shows, I think that security practitioners and leaders, I may be a little biased, but they're superheroes of a sort, combating the forces of darkness. And every superhero has a backstory. So let's start with your backstory. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
That's always a good question. I was born in Mountain Home, Idaho. My father was a pilot in the Air Force, and as I always said, my final act of teenage rebellion was I grew up and joined the Army to jump out of airplanes. So I really spent most of my time as a military family growing up. Obviously, I lived all over the country, settled mostly in Alabama, and that's where I spent the rest of my time growing up.
So I'm always curious, and it's so varied in these interviews. Where did technology, and then secondarily, if it occurred at all, security, did those any nexus early in your early life, high school?
Oh, yeah.
Or even,
Yeah, I was the coolest kid on the street because I had an Apple II Plus computer that had two 5¼ inch floppy drives.
Ooh,
and
the double drive! Wow.
Yeah, I could load Choplifter in one setting. So it goes way back to the 300 baud, Hayes modem BBS days. And yeah, that was where I first got the itch for hacking, because I started learning. Of course, everybody watched things like war games. So we all wanted to be the ultra super hacker, and then we realized it was a whole lot of typing things like ATDT many times. So yeah.
You know what? I think we were influenced by the same stuff. We're of the same era. Okay, you're an enthusiast. You're into it, and you're getting to high school graduation. What happens next? You kind of alluded to you chose to go to the military.
So I actually joined the Army. Joined the Army right out of high school, and did about 8 years mix of active and reserve duty. But in that time, I worked in intelligence, and so I was first really exposed to what we at the time really called computer and network security, kind of separate disciplines, what we now call cybersecurity. But it kind of picked up a passion I picked up a passion for the hacking when I saw somebody one night get mad at somebody on an IRC channel and do the ping minus F and flood ping them. And I thought that was one of the coolest things in the world. And little did I know that was kind of that hacking bug got started again, and realized later on that guess what? We're still doing a lot of things very much like that.
Yeah, it's so interesting to look at those early exploits and compare them to where things are today. And some things are so much further along, and other things are scarily not as far along.
Scarily the same. Yes.
Yeah. So you're in the service, you're cutting your teeth on more stuff in the early stages. Cybersecurity, not even a term back then. I remember information security and those sorts of terms being thrown around. What happens next? You're in those years in the military. Are you looking to get out? Do you have a plan to get out? What happens?
Yeah, so obviously my goal was I was really interested in software development, and that's pretty much where I started my career out. So as I transitioned off active duty and into the reserves, that's where I spent most of my time, was actually, again, going to school and learning about software development. I will always tell people I was the world's worst college student, because I was really going to school, and I found a couple of really good programming jobs. This is the Y2K timeframe. So, I mean, we had an abundance of programmers. Actually, we had an abundance of need for programmers and for system administrators and everything else. And I quickly launched into a career focused heavily in software development. Some of my early career was actually doing things like neural state design at Bell South, and also worked at Bellcore Labs, a couple others in little projects, and in healthcare. So I spent a lot of time on software development, kind of on my early career. And that ended up getting me into what became the tipping point when I started working for, I was working for a number of food suppliers in North America, doing MES and LIMS systems and SPC, manufacturing enterprise systems, the laboratory information management systems, and developing those. And that was kind of my early foray, but when I went from the IT field more over towards automation and industry. But I was still doing software development at that time.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions, and just let me guide this a little bit, because this is one of these nuggets. I'm always looking for the moment that it's a share that a lot of people or the right person could listen to you, go, oh, that's me. Programming, computer programming, you're not doing cyber work, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, so I know that was certainly some things that came up a number of times. Like I remember one of the early stories I have in cybersecurity is we were actually doing all of the Unix systems for like 55 plants in North America. We maintained all of those, did all the development for them and all the system administration. And we had a network administrator that actually was let go. And once somebody from the company came to me and said, hey, we're a little bit concerned possibly, would you guys help out? And so I got my first experience with a logic bomb because we went and looked, and sure enough, the gentleman had written some logic into there that if he did not answer it every couple of weeks, it would have nuked what it would have done was delete the etc directory out of HPUX 10.20, I think at the time. You delete the directory, it'll bring that box to its knees. And he set that up, and we found it within a nick of time and resolved it out of there. So again, little bumps up against cybersecurity, but that was the first real experience I had with a compromise and dealing with a compromise.
So this is interesting. People come, when I do all these interviews, I find people have come from all these different backgrounds. How valuable do you think it's been, especially with the kinds of things you do today, that you came up through programming?
Well, I think it's really key. Again, if you understand programming, especially down at the lower levels, like the assembly language level, right? But if you understand it, and I always said, and I learned some really valuable lessons back then that I've applied later in my career. Like, there's no magic at the assembly level. Whatever's happening and whatever you're seeing on the screen, whatever is going through a debugger, that is what is absolutely happening on the computer. There's no magic. You know exactly what's going on. And some of those early lessons have been very, very helpful, even though I've moved in cybersecurity, I've gone more in the direction of systems and networks and some other things. Some of that programming experience very early on and understanding computer systems very well early on has ended up being very, very valuable later as I've tried to understand some more complex concepts like how file access modifier times work in forensics or something like that. So, when those things have come up, having that deep background and deep systems background has been very helpful in diagnosing other problems because, again, a lot of our cybersecurity threats obviously are going to be malware or other types of things. So even though we aren't really doing the reverse engineering or things, knowing what they can do, knowing how they impact the system and how systems are architected has been very, very useful later in my career.
I think that's an interesting share. So there could be people out there. We know we have people that reach out and say, "Hey, I'm not in the cybersecurity industry. Right. I'd like to get into it." So people who are working in other traditional areas of technology, including software engineering, those are good basis points to cross over.
Absolutely. It brings up an interesting point. I always say this to folks. I get asked all the time, probably like you do, how do I get involved in cybersecurity? And I always tell people, I'm like, look, understand, it's the entire field of IT, the entire field with a 180-degree twist on it. And so if you're a system administrator right now, think about what would you do for diagnosing problems. I mean, a lot of the skills you learn for doing diagnostics, system diagnostics, resolving those are a lot of the same skills you're going to need later when you're hunting something within a system that is a potential security threat or diagnosing or monitoring network traffic. And again, a lot of times, even now, cybersecurity threats and network anomalies and all those things, they look like the exact same thing until they don't. And having those skills. So again, starting where you are, if you're a programmer, you might want to head towards more like vulnerability analysis or malware research. If you're a network administrator, that's a very easy crossover point. But again, start where you are and start applying. How do I approach solving a problem, and how would I potentially go and disrupt the system? And that's going to start getting you into that mindset.
Awesome advice. I love that. I think that's one of those nuggets because people are asking that all the time. How do we break in with this concept that it's a big door that they have to somehow get through? And you're saying just start thinking about it from that perspective, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, when we started our career on this, there really were no cybersecurity programs. You couldn't go to college for that. So almost all of us started where we were, and it was little touch points that suddenly ended up into, hey, how about doing this job in cybersecurity? And that's how a lot of us started. And that's still how, even though a lot of people will follow a more traditional school path for it now, I still recommend them. Like, if you're interested in this, there at any given point, you can kind of transition over to a very similar skill set in cybersecurity.
So let's go back to your story arc. So we're talking programming, cybersecurity aspects of that, the systems that you're looking at. You indicated there's a nexus here with industrial control systems.
Yep.
What's that story? Where does that come together? And I think you end up at a major OEM, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's where I learned the most dangerous thing you can say in your career is sure, whatever. Because I was working, and again, I was doing a lot of work with manufacturing support systems like MES systems and LIMS. So again, very much in the traditional IT space, but applied over into automation. And we started getting involved in a lot of plant diagnostics and problems in plants. And so I'd be going into plant environments and helping to figure out why something on a line wasn't working, right? And so it's kind of weird. Like, again, I started really kind of like, started at the top of that Purdue model and kept working down my entire career. And this is where that first started to happen, is that I was in plant environments doing this kind of work. Well, then we all know what happened on 9/11. So that dates us a little bit on our careers, certainly. It's one of those, yeah, whatever moments that a few months later, I had been involved with ISA 95 standard and ISA 88 standard for enterprise information and also batch control as part of the other job I was doing. And so I happen to know the chairs of one of those. And he came to me one day. He goes, "Hey, wait a minute. You have some experience in cybersecurity, don't you? You know about cyber and you know about automation. We're really interested in getting a cybersecurity standard going." And that was one of those, sure, why not moments. And that's how I ended up being the chair of the ISA 99 Security Committee and starting that. So that's really where that nexus point hit. And even when I made that transition, I was at a smaller integration firm at the time. I made that transition and started, and I was still doing some cyber work, not a lot. I was still doing a lot more systems work. But then I got picked up by Rockwell Automation and was asked to start they had a network services business. And I actually went in and restructured that network services would then include also the higher end design Ethernet services, because that was a big thing going on at the time, and security services as well. So that's where we built that business and that's where I started doing security assessments, network performance tests and evaluations, network designs. And really that's where a lot of that started to grow at that point.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And I'm curious, I should know this about your story. Do you stay industrial focused from that day forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically starting in really my industrial focus started in like 1998. But then as far as industrial cybersecurity, I've been pretty much purely cybersecurity focused since about 2002. So the tail end of 2002. So, you look at even in the industrial cybersecurity field, there was a handful of folks working on it then, and we were the ones really starting to define what it was going to look like. So that was involved with the NIST standard, the PCSRF, with ISA, several other standards bodies, and again, we were all at that time. We were all carving new snow. We were all trying to figure out, what does this need to look like? How do we protect and secure these systems, and what are the real threats to them?
Yeah. So what's the right term for you, pioneer or dinosaur?
Yeah, I don't know. Grumpy lumpkin? I don't know. Pioneer or dinosaur? At this point, I will say that I've been around for a little while, so I'm definitely kind of pioneer. I don't really say dinosaur yet, because I really do keep it as important to really stay on the technical edge of what's going on out there. That's always been my goal, is to stay 2 or 3 years out from where everybody else is thinking to the best I can. So.
Yeah, and I do think I've always thought of you as definitely one of the pioneers in today's discussion. The actual dates of when you're doing some of these things only confirms that. There's only so many people that can trace back that far to say this is when we were starting to really look at this problem. And you're in that group. So we've got.
Yeah, I love when I see in the standard today and they're like mentioning something in the standard. And I'm like, I remember the smoky restaurant we were sitting in and what we were drinking while we were scratching that idea out on the back of a napkin. So
in these early years, and including being roped into getting involved in the standards, any mentors? Is mentorship or mentoring, is that factor into your story at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were a couple that I really stand out. I remember, again, right when I started the ISA 99 committee, we had our first kickoff meeting in Chicago. One of them ended up being Tom Finney of Honeywell, and he had a long history, obviously, in technology development, but also in standards development. And he pulled me aside and was like, "Great job, but here's how you're messing up." And he was right, and he gave really good advice, and he ended up being a really good coach in some of the early standards and technology development work. And then certainly, I had people like right when I joined Rockwell, there were several folks that kind of took interest in what we were doing, and also said, "Hey, well, again, you know the technology. Let me help you with the business aspects of this, and get it into the company and form in the business." So yeah, there was actually several of those that I really owe a lot to right there in the early days. And I'll go ahead and mention another name too. I remember Glenn Schultz when I was at Rockwell was another really big one that really said, "Hey, look, let me show you how to get this into as a business and get it taken seriously." And he helped us grow it to effective business there.
This theme is quite common. I always ask that question, waiting for someone to say, nope, no one ever really gave me any advice. But the truth is, many of you that are now, well-known cybersecurity leaders, somewhere along the way, there were people that were instrumental in that. Can you talk? I get this question from people typically earlier in their career path. They're like, "Well, how do I get one of those?"
Yeah.
And so it's the idea. It seems a little foreign to them of how that connection is made. Is it organic? Is it accidental? Is it purposeful? It's probably for different people, different answers. But what
Yeah.
was it for you?
Again, that's a good question. I don't know that I can answer it well. I know that I tend to have a little more extroverted personality, and so don't really worry about what I say. I mean, I have no problem getting into an environment and really starting to talk and engage folks. And a lot of them really came that way. It's people that I struck conversations up with that were like, well, hey, that's interesting, and again, if you even look a little later, like starting a lot of the cyber physical security stuff, that goes back to a few conversations I had with folks in the industrial safety world, guys like Ed Marzell that we later went on to work with, and Paul Gruen also, bring up a few names there. And these guys were all very instrumental in helping me understand, well, wait a minute, here's some other things that you need to think about. And I went, well, hey, look, okay, great. Now I can apply cybersecurity thinking to this as well. So what will we do to that safety system? So a lot of those really did just come out for me very organically by having conversations that were trying to be forward leading and in talking to related businesses and other people that had a heavy industry presence. So I've not really had anybody that said, hey, let me take you over the shoulder and mentor you. But I've certainly had a lot of people that we generated a lot of discussion and built a good friendship over time. And again, it resulted in things that we now see very common in industry. So,
Do you think someone can reach out to someone proactively in the industry and say, "Hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee? I want to ask you some
yeah.
questions." How effective do you think that strategy is for someone?
I've had a number of people do that, and I certainly am always willing to kind of pull somebody aside and talk to them and answer their questions, and that happens quite a bit. And there's been a couple people I've actually mentored pretty heavily. In fact, actually, I can think of a couple that again, as they were I think one in particular in the last few years, as he was transitioning off his role with the U.S. Army, I spent a lot of time help prep him for here's what you need to here's the training you need to take. Here's the classes, and he and I are now working together on other fronts sometimes. So I definitely think that can help. Most of us are pretty approachable. There can be a little barrier to entry sometime, and it can be intimidating when you're talking to guys that have been in the field for a long time. But most of us, I think, really see it as we've come up through this. And to me, I'm very passionate about this field. I care about what we've done. It's important. So I'm like, hey, yeah, absolutely. I'm more than happy to talk to some folks. It could be the next generation that comes up and does, and we're going to need a lot of talent in this field for the next few years. There's plenty out there. So I definitely encourage. Yeah, absolutely. Strike up a conversation. Yeah, I don't think you'll get told no too many times before you find somebody that, again, they care about this. So they're certainly willing to give you some advice along the way.
Yeah, yeah. I think that I've heard this before, and I think that's compatible with my own experience. And so just reach out, right? Ask.
Sure.
So you're at Rockwell. See, now you're at a major OEM. You had a variety of experiences now. I think you end up at a smaller company soon there.
Yeah, I had one of those conversations with a semi-mentor, actually, now that you mentioned mentor, and it was, well, Bryan, you have to decide if you're a small company guy or a big company guy, right? And I ended up
getting the answer to that question.
Yeah, it was like, well, I've done this on the big company. Let me try the small company. And again, I think it was one thing in my career, I learned it's like, look, be willing to move a lot in the beginning, potentially. Kind of the days of joining a company and staying there a really long time don't happen as often. Certainly those opportunities exist and they're good for folks, but you can a lot of times make a lot of opportunity by seeing an opportunity and making a change, making a targeted change. So I kind of had an opportunity to come up like that and took it. And the first one didn't go quite as well. I mean, I kind of played at a water integrator there for a little while. The market wasn't really ready for it. But then I ended up over at World Tech for a little while too, which again, and that was some of the very early days, a lot of their testing appliances and strategies. And also ended up being very beneficial to the career because I got really, again, if you look at my career, I just kept getting deeper and deeper into the tech and into the control systems over time. So I learned a whole lot by working there and understanding a lot more of the very low level vulnerabilities in control systems.
Awesome. Then talk a little bit about the standards body. And here's the question for you. People ask, or I've even, like, what can I join or plug into or get involved with? People can join and work with standards efforts, right? And that's a great
absolutely.
Way.
Yep.
So how does someone at a lower, like they aren't known level, get involved with standards?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good question because again, for us, we were starting it from the scratch. It was really easy to get involved, But I've heard people say it's like, well, how do I get involved with ISA 99 or 62443 and stuff? And like, well, hey, we'll join this list, and then they get kind of frustrated. And I tell them it's like, look, nobody's going, they are all volunteer organizations. They're ANSI accredited, all volunteer organizations. Anybody can participate. And you got to remember, there are hundreds or thousands of informational people out there that are just monitoring the standard, and only a handful of them that are active at any given time. So if you don't make the effort to start getting involved, you're not going to get pulled in. I mean, you're not going to find it easy to get pulled in. But if you know, and there's two types of people out there. There's people that are contributors, and there's people that are more like reviewers. And the standard needs both, because you'll find a lot of really good content will come in, because people maybe can't sit down and write 30 pages, but they can really edit and provide comments very heavily. And so as a chair of a standards organization, I really learned the value of both. So, be willing to, if you're good at reading, editing, and putting comments in, be willing to read and submit whenever a document comes up for vote. If you're good at writing content, get in touch with not only the committee chairs, but also the subcommittee chairs and the subgroup, the task group chairs. You're going to find for any standard out there that's active, you're going to find a page that gives you information about who to contact. Contact them, ask where you can help, and then stay persistent at it. But I highly recommend it, because getting involved in standards is a really good way, even if you're very early in your career. It's a really good way to learn a lot. It's a good way to get very good exposure, and it's a really good way to make your mark in the industry.
Awesome, good advice. I think people are looking for those things. Like, what do I do outside of my job? Is it affording me much opportunity to get involved or progress in this area? Well, look outside, right? Join one of these efforts.
Yeah. I mean, there's always room for work. That's the nice part. There's always room for people, and there's always a demand for people that are willing to participate. So take advantage of it.
So what happened next after World Tech?
So after World Tech, actually, that is where the beginning, where I really started getting interested in the whole cyber safety. Actually, it was a whole intersection between safety and security, and we knew people were starting to ask questions, about safety instrumented systems. I remember having a couple of those conversations, and they're like, "Oh, the safety system will protect us," and it's like, you start looking at it for a minute and thinking about it. I'm like, actually, and I've always kind of had a side career doing pen testing and stuff. It wasn't really a main one. A couple of things that I did a lot of. So I did forensics a lot, and I did pen testing a lot, but it wasn't really like something that was my core function. But we started looking at these and going, wait a minute, there's ways around this. There's ways that you can compromise, and a lot of them may not be standard attack paths. So we needed to look at those engineering layers of protection, and did we really protect a component or not? So really getting kind of deep in the weeds of it resulted in me having a conversation with Ed Marzell at a company called Connexus, and we really got into a pretty deep discussion. And it took the first time we ever sat down and did it. It took a little while, but he had a stack of PNIDs. Right when we got calibrated to what each of us were looking for, he would go through and he would tell me kind of what would happen in the process, or what conditions you want to have there, and I would sit there and go, okay, well then this is what I would do, this is how I'd modify it, these are the systems I'd go after, this would be the technique. And when we got calibrated to each other, flipping through these things, and I'll never forget, it was actually right after we started Connexus, but it was a flight between Salt Lake City and Idaho Falls, right? So we're heading up there on that flight, and we're flipping through this PNIDs, and it hit both of us at the same time. It's like, look, if you know what each of you are looking for, and you have somebody that knows the process, somebody that knows engineering and what conditions are there, and somebody that knows cyber, then look, these attack paths are there. They're real. And the whole idea that safety systems are enough really falls short very quickly. So again, that actually is where I spent 8 years along with Ed and another gentleman. We had a company that we did together, focused heavily on cybersecurity and the intersection between safety and cybersecurity. So that was really, again, effort focused very much on what it resulted in, again, a lot more of the cyber physical discussions, and really what are the attack paths that get you to the max damage scenarios at a plant, for example.
In a general sense, is that still an opportunity area for people if they're looking for areas to dive deeper in? How mature are we?
That actually is a good question. It is a largely unexplored area. Well, it's largely unexplored, but also a big need. I mean, I had a conversation just yesterday on a security assessment, and they were asking questions about the timing and ladles in the steel mill. And I'm like, I've already done this one. I've already spent time on this, and we found issues related to the timing and how we move things and what the different components were. And and he's like, hey, I really need to understand that. I was like, well, it really does involve us getting down to the C&Es, the cause and effect diagrams, understanding how things are connected, what the engineered layers of protection are. But a few seconds later, we were having a discussion like, more people need to know this, so that when they're designing the system from the first place, did we put all the right layers of protection in or not to protect against a potential safety issue? So it's certainly an area that has a lot of opportunity, a lot of demand, but it takes a little bit of work to get to an engineer to get them to understand that.
Yeah. So in the years after Connexus, I
Mhm.
know very recognizable companies, IO Active,
Mhm.
Red Trident, now at Accenture, focused on innovation. And I think it's interesting your current role, if you talk a little about that, but it seemed to be the way the current role sounds is makes sense based on your career path. A lot of
Yeah,
different.
very much so. IO Active really a lot of fun. It was a really good time to be there because again, I got straight back into pen testing and breaking into systems and spending all my time. And as I said, it's for a long time. We spent years talking about the blue team and how to defend systems and how to keep the hackers out and all those things. And I got frustrated, like lather, rinse, repeat. Every time we went at the show, everybody was saying the same thing. Nobody was taking any action. And I had a presentation I did at Black Hat a few years ago. I was like, you know what? Actually, I did it at S4 the first time. I was like, at a deeper level at Black Hat, I went, you know what? That's it. I'm going to tell you exactly how I get it. I'm going to leave some of the details out, but I'm going to get into exactly what we do when we go through and we want to look at how we attack a system. What does the combined cyber physical look like? And I will certainly say that resulted in some much more meaningful conversations with folks that are like, all right, we believe this now. We know it's a threat, so help us understand that. And that's where I spent my time and coming in. I also started working again a lot more. We're seeing the need for digital forensics and incident response for control systems and OT environments starting to become more and more important. And I was working in that area a lot, working quite a lot in that area as well. So yes, coming into Accenture, you're right. It really just kind of represents the next evolution in my career path because the first things I'm coming in to do are to work on what are those cutting edge disciplines that people are asking for, but we're not fully answering yet. Again, like OT incident response is still a developing field. So it gives an opportunity to really kind of write what that path is going to look like here in the next few years.
Yeah, very cool. So there's your story arc. Let's go back to
Okay.
when you're starting out and give some, advice or thoughts or reflections to your early self.
Yeah, sure. There's a little bit of personality type plays into this, and I certainly know I have a much more outgoing, kind of more of a type A personality. And again, looking at cybersecurity as a whole, it's a huge field. Now, if you're more inclined towards the flipping bits and getting in and understanding software at a very low level, and more of in many cases probably an introverted personality in a lot of cases, then there's some really good paths for you. But and there's a lot of rewards in there too. I know some people that work in that field that do very, very well. For me, I know it was a little different. I tended to be much more outgoing, much more like, hey, I want to see what the next challenge is. I want to keep working on that next challenge, help define what the next step is. So I've always really said, okay, what conversations do I need to have? What meeting, who do I need to get to meet? And a lot of it is, I think everybody fights the imposter syndrome. And I certainly know that, for as much as I was out there talking and trying to push things, I fought it as well. A lot of times I'm like, I'm learning it as I'm talking about it, and you got to be willing to embrace that a little bit. Be willing to risk being wrong a little bit, because I certainly learned a lot of good things by being wrong, and just really keeping that conversation going. But I think a lot of people want to think that they have to know it perfectly before they can do it. That really is not the case. You just need to be disciplined in how you approach it, and there'll be people there to help you along. But yeah, I think probably the biggest thing is don't listen to the imposter syndrome. Just be willing to take a chance.
That's a great nugget out of this interview, Bryan. I think that's something that many people face or try to deal with, and if they've never heard anybody talk about it, it's all internal, and they don't realize, oh, other people feel that way too.
Everybody's that's the thing I learned. Everybody out there feels the same way, and
I
to
can
wonder.
think of a few people, and you and I both know them, that don't ever think they're an imposter. They think they do
Yeah.
know it, but
Well, there are definitely areas I walk into. I'm like, okay, I absolutely know I've got this, in this room. But there are other
yeah,
places I go, yep, I'm out of my element. So
yeah, yeah.
it is a little bit of a variable state, I suppose. So.
Yeah, and awareness is self-awareness is a gift at times, I think. Okay, so let's talk about any during that during any of those chapters of your story, so to speak. Any challenges and how you overcame them that come to mind?
Again, I'm back at a big company now, and it's kind of interesting. I'm in a role now that kind of gives me a very similar innovation capability. I mean, like kind of small team thinking. One thing I learned early on is, a lot of people's cybersecurity went straight for one industry area. They went straight for resources over into oil and gas and things like that. And I know the one thing I learned is that, right, and this is probably a really good example right today. Economic downturns are going to happen, right? Big things like that are going to happen. I mean, the first big one was the Y2K timeframe that I dealt with. The next one was right after I started Connexus in October 2008. And so, learning to be ready to turn on a dime. And so the one thing that has ended up being very valuable in my career was I have worked in almost in every industry type out there. I've had experience, and I can't imagine one that I have not been in some level. But a lot of that was because the markets are always changing a little bit. And there's demand, there's like I've heard that there's a bull market somewhere everywhere. And I found that to be true. So the biggest thing I would encourage folks and from challenge is that times are going to change and you've got to be ready to move with them. And if you're not ready, or if you are just stuck in one way of thinking, it's going to be very problematic. And I know that certainly I started companies, or I started businesses and things right at times that went great. Like right now is a good example. I just started a few months ago, and being ready to say, okay, where are the tea leaves of the market say it's going? What do we need to adapt to? But I think that that's probably one of the biggest challenges I've had, have been facing how the market changes and being ready to adapt to it.
Yeah, good advice. And apropos to today, I mean, there's no question. Do you see today any, there's plenty of negative to go around. What do you see as far as cybersecurity industry and the impact of the global pandemic?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been some good things. I really noticing, people are realizing, hey, look, we really can do a lot of this work remotely, and making I'm running an assessment right now where it's going a lot better than I would have thought in many cases for doing something totally remote. And it's actually set up in many ways even a better conversation with the customers than I normally would have. Because we're having to interact a lot more over the phone, and we're getting a lot more of their input. So, I mean, the fact that we're working a lot more remote, I really am kind of seeing that there's a more willingness to it. It's making more things available. But again, I think probably the biggest thing is we are seeing that organizations are starting to go, we really do need to have a better handle on how we're monitoring our environments. Because maybe we can't go into the plant every day. Maybe we can't get to those areas. So I'm definitely seeing a lot more people start to say, I need to have better visibility of what's going across my wires. So I've already watched several folks in the last couple of months really start pushing hard towards solutions that will allow them to do that, because they realize, you know what, I may not be able to get to those areas as well as I used to, or maybe it's just a cost savings or a big benefit to make that data more online. So I'm definitely, it's early, obviously, but that's one thing I'm seeing certainly.
Oh, that's great. Great. Okay, so let's talk about professional development, things you did outside of what maybe job required, things you chose to do, because that's something that people can emulate. That's something that our listeners can say, oh, I'm over here and maybe I feel stuck, or maybe my manager's not supporting me growing to where I want to go. Right. What things can I do outside of this or choose to do? What did you do, and what would you suggest? Could be two different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember when I was first in the intelligence field, I had a drill sergeant. I had one of our instructors in the school that came up and said, you don't have to know everything. You just have to know where to look it up. And unfortunately, that became very expensive advice, as I bought lots and lots of books over the years. But I was constantly studying, constantly reading. There's one I learned. Are
you an author of a book? I think right where my index finger.
We got two of them out. Yes. We got two different books. Cybersecurity. There's a cybersecurity for industrial control systems, and there's a hacking exposed theory for industrial control systems that I've been a co-author on each of those. Probably on your shelf up there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of these right in. Yeah, here we go.
There you go. Perfect. There you go. Yeah. So there's myself and some of the other authors on that one. Yeah, that was definitely fun. Definitely. Writing a book was an interesting experience, and it never hurts. If you get a chance to write a book, it absolutely never hurts when you walk into a customer environment and they hold your book up and go, "Is this you?" It's like, all right, credibility's good. We're good. We can start working now. Yes. It definitely helps. And it certainly was an opportunity to kind of codify some of the stuff that we were doing in industry at the time, and then learn some new things. So I definitely recommend it if you get that chance. But yeah, going back to it, as a software developer, we were constantly being faced with different programming languages a lot of times too. And so I would go home and I'd read a book and I'd learn a programming language over the weekend sometime. And I think I coded somewhere around 32 languages professionally by the time I kind of put that down. But it gave me a lot of experience. So certainly in cybersecurity, as I've kind of evolved that career, I've always tried to have something I'm working on. And still to this day, I've always got something I'm working on. And there's, kind of a core set of skills that people a lot of times really start with. And, I started software development and had to learn more of the networking, and found out that was the network and penetration testing and system manipulation. That ended up being my passion. So I had to mid-career, as I was starting all this stuff, I was learning it all myself at the same time. So but definitely, even today, you've got a lot more options like taking courses online. And I mean, I'm always working on something like that. So.
I think that's another great set of advice, especially as you talked about mid career changes and not being afraid to do that. Just start picking up some of the additional language. And you touched on something I've also heard people speak about, which is understanding the fundamental nature of needing to understand networking.
Yep.
To apply to a lot of this stuff, that the way the network functions is pretty critical.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's probably, again, this goes all the way back to the Rockwell days, because we were diagnosing massive network failures all the time and figuring out what was going on. But it's still the most overlooked aspect of cybersecurity in my mind. It's the most overlooked aspect of even software development, because I've watched people and companies struggle for days, weeks, and even months and years in some cases with bad problems, and they were blaming the application, they were blaming the computers, they were blaming everything but what it actually was. And remember the comment earlier about assembly language. There's no magic at the assembly level. There's no magic at the packet layer. And I got to give credit to my friend Brad Hagrat for that quote. We've used that for years. There's no magic. What's on the wire is what's on the wire. And if you have good network diagnostic skills, they can be very useful in diagnosing a number of other problems out there. And even from a security threat standpoint, most people miss a lot of security threats because they don't ever look at what's going across the wire. So I definitely think it's an underappreciated and undervalued skill, but it's one of the most useful ones I've found in my career.
Awesome, good advice. So, what is exciting you about the future? What are you peering? If you had to peer ahead and say this one thing or a couple things, is not only most exciting to you, but you think it's also opportunities for people, especially earlier in their career path, to start focusing themselves.
Yep, absolutely. I think we're looking at a couple of big trends in the industry, obviously, and there's that we've been pushing on this trend for quite a while. The more connected assets within the plant. Well, now it has a fancy name, right? We've got Industry 4.0, X.0, or whatever you want to call it. But it is really looking at what we can do with cloud architectures, what we can do with AI, what we can do with more IoT, the ability that we have to monitor plants and all the conditions out there. If you look at a lot of offshore operations, maybe one example, the reason people are out there on the offshore is because they still need the human intervention out there, right? And it's also the most dangerous part of their job, having to put them out in that environment. So the more we're starting to gather and process data, and the better we're able to trend and analyze it, the more we're going to be able to do without actually having a lot of human intervention. The more availability we're going to see in our plants, the better we're going to diagnose cybersecurity threats as they change, as they evolve onto the system. So I mean, definitely there's a lot of area of opportunity there, because to achieve those goals is going to require a lot of modernization, a lot of scaling of assets, a lot of building of larger networks, and certainly some of the stuff we're looking at now is zero trust models for ICS, some of the big cloud authentication models that, hey, look, a lot of the things we're doing with devices, we don't have to worry about some of the security. Well, we don't have to worry so much about a lot of those security threats that we did before. So a lot of the end devices, they're going to be in a model that is much more enforced by cybersecurity path. I mean, all kinds of certificates, and obviously encryption. A lot of those technologies are becoming more available, and they're getting lower bandwidth so they can be deployed in even these larger environments. So I think it's definitely the big data, AI, whatever you want to call those changes. It represents a lot of really interesting growth for a lot of customers. It also represents a lot of interesting opportunity for cybersecurity to really be in the front of, all right, what does it mean to do all of this condition-based monitoring remotely, and how do we feed that data back in? But if I'm sending my condition-based monitoring offsite to a third party, how do I trust it when it comes back? How do I make sure that it fits into my environment, lab samples, and everything else? So there's a lot of really good cybersecurity opportunity that you get really good benefit for the technologies out there, but you're going to need cybersecurity folks asking the right questions to what do we do with this data when it comes back? How do we trust it? How do we vet it? How do we make sure that it's not actually introducing a problem into the process? So, again, while all those connectivity challenges or connectivity opportunities bring us good technology and a lot of neat things forward looking, it also brings us new security challenges that it's going to take people with a very keen eye to sort out what is safe, what's going to add more risk to the process.
Oh yeah, you've hit on some great areas for anybody to look into. AI, machine learning. You're talking about new encryption schemes, certificate distribution. I mean, all sorts of. You're really talking also about the ultimate convergence, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
These OT networks and these IT networks, and more discussions over recent years about OT and IT.
Yeah.
Aren't you painting a picture for networks?
Yeah. And that's something we've been pushing for a long time. The security is not IT and OT; it's just security, right? And we've been pushing that for a long time. And that's certainly core to the message I drive today. And I think I've mentioned I've been getting a lot more involved in incident response. And one of those was actually really defining what the IR capability was going to have to look like for large multinational corporations and global response. And really, what we were learning there is how do we get the needle out of the stack of needles, right? How do we find all networks are going to have noise on them? All things are going to have it out there. How do we sort out what's actually going? And we've started getting some really interesting correlation engines and AI analytics that are helping us to laser in very quickly on what the timeline is of where certain events started to occur. And so even though I've been doing incident response and forensics for years, I've been really excited what I've seen in the last couple of years because it's really allowed us to get in time slice systems much more quickly to figure out what was the point of infection, where did the actors go, what are we looking for next. That's one of the biggest ones I've seen lately is we're starting to go based upon all of these companies that a threat actor is going after. Can you extrapolate a trend of what they're going to do next? And when we've been able to look at that and go, I think this is what's going to happen next, and then we start seeing it, it's been very exciting to see it, predict it, and then see it actually happen, to watch certain events occur. So we're getting those technologies are providing us some really new opportunities that we're just on the front end of starting to understand what we can do with them.
Fantastic. Okay, now we're at my favorite part of all these interviews, where I steal something from a show I've always liked, Inside the Actor Studio. It ran on channels all over the world. It is highly distributed for decades. It was hosted by James Lipton, who used to interview all the famous actors on his stage. And he ended his interviews with the Pivot questionnaire, which he borrowed from a French show prior to that. So this goes back a long way, and it's the same questions, I think, from the French show to Inside the Actor Studio to the questions I'd ask you today. You ready?
Okay, let's do it.
All right. What is your favorite word?
My favorite word? Oh, good Lord. I don't think I can actually say that on the air, but it goes back to the military days, and it's definitely a four-letter expletive that starts with the word F. So
well, you're gonna get. That's funny. That's another question on here. What is your least favorite word?
Probably like most people, moist. Yeah.
What turns you on, either creatively, spiritually, or emotionally? What turns you on?
So I think and it's weird. I found my creative side much later in life. I've always liked music and things like that. It's in the family. Go by the last name. But yeah, it was like in my 30s that I really found my creative side. And so yeah, a lot of really getting out, making to create, to build. Started making jewelry. Started doing a lot of metal art, photography. So I've incorporated that as part of everything that I do. And so it's a core part of me now that I have to have kind of creative outlets along with my technical outlets. And interestingly enough, I will say, I still think that if you want to be a good pen tester, the best pen testers I know are actually more creative than they are technical. They're more creative mindset. Pen testing, breaking into systems, it's a creative process. So almost all the really good pen testers I know are musicians, or they're artists, or they're painters. There's something else out there. And I've noticed that that's become, I've noticed more and more that that's a big trend, is that it's much more of a creative process. And people like that are drawn more into the penetration field, testing field.
Awesome. What turns you off?
Endless conference calls. Yeah.
You're loving COVID. What is your favorite curse word? See, here we go, Bryan.
I said definitely fuck.
What sound or noise do you love?
What sound or noise do I love? Rain on a tin roof. So.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Screeching babies in the seat behind me on the middle seat when I'm flying in the middle seat.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Profession other than my own, I'd like to attempt. So I said probably it would be something on photojournalism or something like that. Just the passion of creating stories. Yep.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Well, certainly it's you made it in by the skin of your teeth, son.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bryan Singer, for being on the show. It's always a pleasure to have someone with as much energy and things to share as you have. So thanks again.
Thanks, Eric, man. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Take care. Be well.
Thank you.